Objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to offer an amendment to the underlying bill. This amendment is designed to give American employers some relief from the regulatory burdens that continue to hold back our economy and hinder job creation. This amendment is actually identical to a bill I introduced in April, S. 817, which has been endorsed by both the Chamber of Commerce and the National Federation of Independent Businesses. It's the same amendment I also introduced on the Small Business Bill, the Economic Development Administration bills, and it's also part of the larger regulatory relief bill I introduced in June, which currently has 22 co-sponsors. Last week, as we know, we heard more troubling economic news. This time it was the June jobs report, which unfortunately showed the unemployment rate had actually risen to 9.2%, and hiring slowed to just 18,000 new jobs. These are, of course, very disappointing numbers, but much more important is about the families who are affected by it, families in my home state of Ohio and across the nation who are struggling to find a job and to get the paycheck they need to make ends meet. The real discussion in Washington this month in particular has been focused on the fiscal reforms, and we need to get our fiscal house in order to get the economy back on track. But there are other things that we can do as well. And one, of course, is to reduce the regulatory burden, particularly on small businesses. I hear from them all the time. I'm sure my colleagues do as well. This burden is increasing. One recent study commissioned by the Small Business Administration put that burden at $1.75 trillion annually. By the way, that's more than the IRS collects in income taxes. I've been encouraged by what the current administration has been saying about these regulations, but I continue to be deeply concerned about the new regulatory costs that this administration is imposing as we meet here today on the private sector. We've seen a sharp uptick over the past 2 years in what's called a major or economically significant rule. These are regulations that have an economic effect of $100 million or more. According to the Office of Management and Budget in the Obama administration and also the GAO, the current administration has been regulating at a pace of 84 of these major rules per year, which, by the way, is a 50% increase over the average regulatory output during the Clinton administration, which had 56 major rules per year. These figures include both the executive branch agencies and the so-called independent agencies. Today, I was pleased to see that President Obama issued a new executive order that specifically addressed independent agencies. These are the regulatory bodies that are not within the executive agencies, but are considered independent. They would include the Commodities Future Trading Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the newly created Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which has been subject to a lot of debate here on the floor. These are all independent agencies, which are designed by law to be insulated from presidential control. This new order the President issued today and the accompanying presidential memorandum endorse two goals. First, it asks independent agencies to participate in ongoing regulatory look-backs. That means looking back retrospectively at rules that are already on the books to see whether they make sense. Every administration since President Ronald Reagan has done this, undertaken some kind of a look-back, and it's important this work continue. Second, and more importantly in my view, it calls on independent agencies to evaluate the costs and the benefits of new regulations, as executive agencies are already required to do under executive orders, including an executive order by President Clinton and an executive order by President Obama in January. I'm encouraged by the words of this new executive order and presidential memorandum on independent agencies. It endorses a very common sense principle that independent agencies, no less than executive agencies, should evaluate the costs of new regulations before imposing a new burden on the economy. It's common sense. It's also consistent with these amendments that I've been offering on legislation this year and the independent agency part of the regulatory relief bill that I introduced in June. The problem is that the President's order today is entirely non-binding because independent agencies don't answer to the President. So it has no force of law. The amendment I'm offering today would effectively write the President's new request into law. So the President has now agreed with this principle. We need to expand this cost-benefit analysis to independent agencies, but we need legislation in order to do it because these independent agencies are not answerable to the President. Specifically, this amendment would extend the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act of 1995, which was a bipartisan piece of legislation where I was the Republican co-sponsor in the House, and it expands it to independent agencies. Major rules issued by what's sometimes called the headless fourth branch of government are today exempt not only from the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, but also from the cost-benefit review overseen by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, at the Office of Management and Budget. So this amendment would change that, effectively making the President's order that he issued today binding on these independent agencies. They'd be required under the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act to evaluate regulatory costs, benefits, and less costly alternatives before issuing any rule that would impose a cost of $100 million or more on the private sector or on state, local, tribal governments. Based on the GAO data, it appears that there are nearly 200 independent agency regulations that have been issued between 1996 and 2011. That would be considered major, in other words, have over a $100 million impact on the economy. And they were excluded, again, from review under this cost-benefit analysis we've been talking about. In 2009 and 2010 alone, the last couple of years, independent agencies issued 56 economically significant regulations, representing billions of dollars in regulatory costs, exempt from the standard cost-benefit analysis rules. But this affects our economy in big ways, affects jobs and our ability to get this economy back on track. Closing this independent agency loophole is a reform that those of us on both sides of the aisle should join the President in supporting. This is the right vehicle to be able to achieve that. No major regulation, whatever its source, should be imposed on American employers or on state and local governments without a serious consideration of what the costs are, what the benefits are, and whether there is available a less burdensome alternative to achieve the same objective. This amendment moves us closer toward that goal. It's a common sense amendment, again, taking the President's executive order and memorandum of today and actually putting it into force through the force of law. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, and I note the absence